From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, January 13th, 2015. In the wake of one of Nigeria's worst death tolls, we'll turn to foreign policy analyst Ajamu Baraka on the militant group Boko Haram, as well as upcoming elections in Nigeria. And Scott Timberg, former LA Times arts reporter, joins us in studio to discuss his new book. It's called Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Good morning, Sonali.
The embattled French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo has released its latest issue today, its first since the horrific attack last Wednesday by armed men at its offices, which resulted in 12 deaths. 10 of the people killed were members of the magazine's staff, including its editor, Stéphane Charbonnier. The latest cover features yet another cartoon image of the Prophet Muhammad, a move that most Muslims find highly offensive. The Prophet is shown holding a sign saying Je suis Charlie with the cryptic caption, "All is forgiving." Instead of the usual run of 60,000 copies, there will be 3 million copies of this new issue published. Many journalistic outlets around the world have republished the cover of the magazine in solidarity with its staff. And here on Uprising, we've decided not to show an image for our TV audience, even as we, of course, condemn the massacre. And those who want to know what it looks like can Google it. Bob, what do you make of this decision by the remaining magazine staff to have such a cover and by others in the media to republish it?
Well, I'd endorse the Uprising approach. You seem to be able to keep two ideas in mind. One is that, of course, the killing of journalists, the murder of anyone, is morally unacceptable, but also bigotry and racism in cartoons is unacceptable. So, you know, the cartoonists of this magazine have consistently used their platform to ridicule and express contempt for Islam. You know, these are being phrased as if they're political satire that's, you know, getting at people in power, but it's not. It's an insult to more than 1 billion people worldwide. Some of those cartoons have been, you know, extremely racist. So I think that republish them is the wrong move. We have to be able to keep these two ideas separate, the condemnation of the killings, and I would say the condemnation of racist journalism.
Even as the Western world celebrates the sanctity of press freedom, here in the U.S., a chapter in the long-running battle to preserve such freedom has finally ended. The U.S. Justice Department has decided not to call New York Times reporter James Risen to testify at the trial of a former CIA officer. At stake is journalists' ability to protect the secrecy of their sources. Mr. Risen, who wrote the book Pay Any Price, Greed, Power, and Endless War, would have faced prison time had he been required to testify and refused. Risen is a 2-time Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and has focused his career not on provoking religious fervor, but on exposing the U.S. national security state. While the pursuit of Risen began under the Bush administration, it continued and even intensified under President Obama, who, according to the Times, quote, has brought more charges in leak cases than were brought in all previous administrations combined. Well, Bob, it appears as though Attorney General Eric Holder, as one of his last acts in office, has finally done the right thing.
I think so, although we might want to ask, why is he doing the right thing? There has been an incredible outcry against forcing James Risen to testify and reveal sources. Remember, the government has been willing to put journalists in jail in the past, and I have no doubt it would have been willing to do it again if not for the really consistent critique that was leveled. And of course, as you point out, this is part of a broader critique of the Obama administration's attack on leakers and journalists. So let's applaud this, but remember that the person on trial, Sterling, is still being prosecuted, and I would say persecuted, for leaking, for engaging the act of whistleblowing, for telling the American public things we have a right to know. So this battle, in a sense, is only half won. There's still a man on trial who should not be facing that trial.
And finally, 2 police officers have been charged with murder in the case of the fatal shooting of a homeless man in Albuquerque, New Mexico last year. The 38-year-old white man named James Boyd was killed after a 4-hour standoff when police threw a flashbang grenade at him and then shot him several times. A video of the shooting from the helmet camera of one of the officers shows that Boyd was dozens of yards away from police and attempting to leave peacefully when he was fired at. After many months of public outrage and protests, District Attorney Kerry Brandenburg decided simply to bring charges rather than convene a secret grand jury, as was done in Ferguson and New York. Meanwhile, in South Carolina early this morning, a case in the shooting death of a black man by a white officer, former police officer, was declared a mistrial after jurors apparently could not come to a decision. Well, Bob, it appears that we may be making some progress with at least charging officers in the case of James Boyd. How do you view these two stories?
Well, let's remember that in Albuquerque, there has been consistent public protest about this case and about a larger pattern of police use of force and deadly force that's unjustified. So my guess is that the district attorney didn't go to a grand jury because there was that public protest. That's a reminder that we're talking about a legal system, but politics affects the way the legal system operates. It's a reminder that grand juries are really not juries in the sense that we use that term. They're a tool of prosecutors, and anyone who's ever covered the courts and been in the system knows that prosecutors can lead grand juries pretty much anywhere they want to. In the other case where there was a mistrial, it was a horrific case. It's hard to imagine why that police officer is avoiding responsibility in this case if you read the details of it, but at least it was a jury of his peers. And so there is progress, I think, but it's progress because of the protest, and that's important for people to remember.
Well, Bob Jensen, always a pleasure to have you on. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is our daily Newsflash guest expert. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. By the way, you can now watch Uprising on Free Speech TV, which airs on Dish Network, Channel 9415, DirecTV Channel 348, and hundreds of part-time cable affiliates, and on Roku. We'll be right back in a minute. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Last week's shocking headline that Boko Haram may have killed 2,000 people in Nigeria was eclipsed by wall-to-wall coverage of the armed attack in France that left 20 people dead. Rebel soldiers from the militant group Boko Haram stormed the town of Baga in the northeastern Nigerian state of Borno on January 3rd, coming in from a number of sides over several days. International soldiers who had been protecting the town fled, leaving residents to defend themselves. Hundreds of people attempting to flee and swam across Lake Chad and are thought to have drowned. Amnesty International and other groups have reported that the death toll may have been as high as 2,000, the single worst casualty rate attributed to Boko Haram to date. And then this past weekend, 3 suicide attacks carried out in 2 separate incidents left nearly 24 people dead. Horrifically, the attacks were the result of bombs being strapped to children. One of the incidents took place on Saturday in a market in Maiduguri when 19 people were killed after explosives attached to a 10-year-old girl were detonated. The conflict, which has gone on for years, has reached a breaking point and now spilled over the border into Cameroon, with reports this week of a Boko Haram attack on a Cameroonian military base. Clashes between the Nigerian military and Boko Haram forces are also ongoing. The Archbishop of Jos in central Nigeria, Ignatius Kaigama, this week openly accused the international community of ignoring the crisis in his nation. We turn now to Ajamu Baraka. He's a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and a foreign policy expert. Hi, Ajamu.
Hello, good to be with you again.
So to hear that bombs are being strapped to children, is this a game changer?
Well, it definitely is. I mean, of course, it violates all understandings of what is seen as proper behavior in any kind of conflict. The use of children is abhorrent, even in conflict, but is even more abhorrent when you have children being strapped with bombs. But this, again, is some of the kinds of behaviors we've seen from this particular group in their in their fight with the Nigerian government.
It seems as though Boko Haram might have expanded its aspirations from wanting to topple the Nigerian government to now wanting to establish an Islamic caliphate across West Africa. In just the last few weeks, it's taken over large swaths of the north, destroyed something like 16 towns. And some people are saying that this group is much more dangerous than ISIS, the Islamic State militant group in northern Iraq and Syria. How do you explain what motivates Boko Haram?
Well, I think the similarity between the two groups is that they both now have territorial aspirations. That they are now committed to establishing control over a contiguous landmass. That is why the attack on Baga was one that should be seen as a strategic attack, because the placing of that military installation was seen as a strategic attempt to try to cut in half the territory that Boko Haram is contesting from the Nigerian government. So I don't see them as being more dangerous than ISIS. The similarity is that they're now committed to territorial integrity, if you will. Both are being motivated by the right-wing Wahhabist Islamic teachings. Both see themselves as defenders of the faith, and committed to struggling against what they see as corrupt governments.
So in this town of Baga, this was supposed to be a sort of last stronghold, a holdout against Boko Haram's expansion. It was being protected, apparently, by international troops, international African troops from other African countries. Why did the troops, as far as you can tell, abandon this town when Boko Haram attacked and just left thousands of civilians to defend themselves?
Well, actually, the multinational basing of those troops from Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, had not actually happened yet. The troops that were in Baga were primarily Nigerian troops. And that's why the attack was so strategic for Boko Haram. Those troops were scheduled to arrive fairly soon to serve as a base for military operations against Boko Haram. Boko Haram preempted that by the military assault on that base. Once they assaulted the base, then the assault was in two phases. After they assaulted the base, then there was a generalized attack against the town of the city of Baga and the surrounding towns.
Just days after the attack on Baga and another part of the country, the capital Lagos, Nigerian President Goodluck Jonathan launched his re-election campaign for the upcoming presidential and general elections that are taking place on February 14th. And he's promised to create 2 million jobs if he remains president. What do you make of this campaign promise? And what is President Jonathan's culpability with the Boko Haram attacks? Under his presidency, doesn't seem like much has been done. If anything, things have gotten worse.
Well, I think that we know that politicians make all kinds of outlandish commitments to their constituencies or potential constituencies. Of course, that claim was a claim to try to address the socioeconomic contradictions of not only of Nigerian society, but of the North and Northeast specifically, where much of the contested fighting between Boko Haram and the Nigerian authorities are taking place. Everyone knows that that part of Nigeria has been fairly neglected. They have created the sort of socioeconomic foundation for the recruitment of Boko Haram, recruiting the poor from the rural parts of the country, and even from the cities, people who are unemployed, who have no other, no real means of taking care of themselves. They have found that those individuals tended to be open to the arguments being made by Boko Haram that the only way they're going to address their material interests was by overthrowing the dictatorial and corrupt regime in the South. So in that sense, Goodluck Jonathan and most of the Nigerian elite are collaborators, if you will, with the insurgency represented by Boko Haram in the northern part of that country.
And there are major concerns that this huge attack by Boko Haram, really kind of upping the ante, could impact turnout during the elections, which of course is never a good thing if we think that democratic participation in elections is an important part of a democracy. Do you think that people will be too scared to turn out?
I think that the likelihood of a democratic participation, a democratic process in northeastern Nigeria is pretty slim. Even the independent electoral commission has said that if the federal government is unable to provide security to its personnel, then the likelihood of them deploying people to conduct an election is very slim. So the disconnecting of that territory, the states of Adamawa and Yobe and Borno is in fact taking place. That they have in effect decided or ensured that if there are individuals who want to participate in the democratic process, that's really not going to happen in that part of the country, which is one of their main strategic objectives.
Now, Cameroon's President Paul Biya, understandably concerned about this conflict spilling over into Cameroon, has called on the international community for help. I quoted the Archbishop of Jos earlier as well. And Paul Biya has essentially called for coordinated international effort against Boko Haram because a military base on across the border in Cameroon has now been attacked and taken over. First, what is Boko Haram's interest in Cameroon? And second, what do you make of a calling on the international community to crack down on Boko Haram? Because, of course, what that simply means is greater military might from the outside.
Well, you see, that's been part of the problem with the response to Islamic fundamentalism. The natural tendency to only respond to it in military means, in a military way. Of course, we understand the concern of the Cameroonian authorities. Cameroon is contiguous with Nigeria. It's clear that Boko Haram has used part of its territories as rear bases. Same can be said with the concerns of the authorities in Chad and also in Niger. It is now a multinational concern. The problem is that basically, if you don't address the socioeconomic contradictions in Nigeria, then the military capacity, the military tool, if you will continue to be used. Look, the international community in the form of an appeal to the U.S. took place already when the Bring Back Our Girls campaign launched. It was said that once the U.S. got involved, a competent military, then not only would they bring back our girls, but they would be able to militarily defeat Boko Haram. That has not happened. So the military option cannot be the only option in these kinds of cases.
And that's a really good point. Let's also turn now specifically, I'm glad you brought up this campaign that took place last summer when hundreds of Nigerian young women and girls were abducted by Boko Haram. It led to this international social media campaign, #BringBackOurGirls. What has happened of that campaign, and do you consider it a misguided campaign to begin with?
I think that the sentiment was correct. It was moral outrage that these innocent young women would be caught up in the nightmare of Nigerian politics and terroristic attacks. So that's the response was understandable. The issue was that the response gave an entry point, if you will, to the U.S. that had an interest in becoming more involved in internal Nigerian politics and more involved militarily, directly in Nigeria. So the sentiments, the concerns that were being expressed put significant pressure on the Nigerian authorities to allow the U.S. in, to allow the U.S. Overflight rights in Nigerian territory to help them to, quote unquote, bring back our girls. So for many of us who are concerned about that, concerned about the growing influence and presence of the U.S. African Command or AFRICOM, we were very much concerned about this very understandable response from the international community. But we knew that there are more nefarious political intentions sometimes involved in these humanitarian concerns. So it wasn't a bad campaign, but it has some deeper political implications.
Right. And so, Ajamu, if we know that a U.S.-led military campaign against Boko Haram is more than likely to fail because we have the examples of not only the ISIS war from last year, but the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, then what is the context within which we need to see the crisis in Nigeria and a constructive solution? Because, of course, one thing that we haven't yet mentioned and really do need to mention is that Nigeria is the site of major oil reserves, and multinational corporations have headquarters there and have operations there, which is part of the issue that Boko Haram says motivates them as well.
Well, of course, that motivates Boko Haram. It motivates the U.S. to want to maintain its influence in Nigeria. It wants to make sure that they keep Nigeria firmly in their camp. They understand that the Chinese are also deepening their contacts and influence with the Nigerian government. So there are these levels of complexities when it comes to what's happening in Nigeria. What can be more constructive? The demilitarization of the conflict. We have to make the connections, those of us in the West, the connections between the emergence of these terroristic insurgencies and their connections to very powerful interests in the West itself. We have talked about before the connection between the enhancement of the military capacities of Boko Haram and what occurred in Libya with the transfer of weapons, the enhancement of the insurgency that took place in Mali, that became a staging ground and space for additional training. So these connections have to be made, and we have to put pressure on Western governments who pretend to be opposed to Islamic fundamentalists to force them to cease the covert support of these very same forces.
Well, at the same time as the details of the terrible massacre and death toll in Baga was unfolding, we had last week the attacks at the offices of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo in Paris, which captured world attention, and many have commented that it has eclipsed a far larger death toll in Nigeria that we are talking about today. How do you view these two stories?
I see them as a obvious a manifestation of the ethical contradiction among many people in the West, even many human rights activists, in which the fact of the matter is that some lives matter more than others. Those of us who are human rights activists, we argue for and believe in the equal value of all life. The very fact that we had this outpouring of concern, real concern with the innocent deaths in Paris, it seemed that outpouring of concern was disproportionate to what was happening in other parts of the world. Why Paris? Why will we have this kind of support, this kind of attention, at the same time that we had reports that were leaking out about the massacre in Baga? Why no comments from the masses at this rally in Paris on Sunday, a rally that was supposed to be an anti-terrorist rally? Or why not expressions of solidarity with what's happening in Nigeria, what's happening in other parts of the world? No, the attention seemed to be primarily on the tragedy of European death. And we see that as a moral contradiction, not only in France, but we see it as one that sort of characterizes the contradictory approach that many people who call themselves human rights activists from the West are involved in.
And finally, Ajamu, it seems as though, just broadly speaking, and maybe I'm being too simplistic here, but around the world, we are seeing every day, every month, unfolding crises where ordinary people who just want to live their lives, want basic things like human rights and democracy, are caught between Western imperialist actions and motives and fundamentalist extremist armed groups, neither of which represent a vast majority of ordinary people. And this seems to be a sort of pattern for the crisis, the modern crisis, globally speaking today. Is that something that you would sort of see as a pattern?
It's a pattern, is a result of very conscious policies. I mean, when Islamic fundamentalists were basically or essentially weaponized beginning in the late 1970s, they became a very convenient force, controlled and led in many cases by powerful Western interests from the U.S. Through to Israel. People have to remember that the whole creation and evolution of Hamas, many people argue, was connected to the strategic interests of Israel.
And similarly, the Taliban resulting from U.S. arming of jihadi groups in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. So we have this makeup of social forces in the world now. Luckily, we have a third force, and that is the people themselves who are organizing themselves, who have a vision that goes beyond what they are being exposed to now and their current sufferings. And that is those struggles in various parts of the world that we have to really be mindful of and be in alignment with, because it's more than just a struggle between the U.S. and Western Europe and radical Islam. It is a struggle to redefine what it means to be human and what kinds of societies we're going to have to organize in order for us to be able to fully realize our humanity.
Well, Ajamu, I want to thank you as always for joining us, and I'm sure we'll have you back on again in the future. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ajamu Baraka is a fellow at the Institute for Policy Studies and a foreign policy expert. This is Uprising. When we come back, we'll speak with Scott Timberg about his new book, Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. You can now watch Uprising online at our YouTube channel. That's at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Please do subscribe. We live in an era when independent bookstores and record stores are so rare they're akin to an endangered species. And yet, books are more plentiful than ever, with online monopolies making them easily and cheaply available. So many newspapers have shuttered and put journalists out of work, and yet more people than ever are blogging, tweeting, or working for entirely online enterprises. But artists and the industries that connect them to people are living in precarious times, relying increasingly on corporate gatekeepers for fewer dollars. While it's hard to see exactly how our cultural landscape is shifting and where it will settle, my guest, Scott Timberg, has attempted to map the sorry state of affairs facing the nation's creative class, as he calls it. In a new book called Culture Crash, The Killing of the Creative Class, Timberg, a former LA Times arts reporter, takes us on a journey through the tectonic shifts in art and culture at the crossroads of the Great Recession, the rise of the internet, the branding of everything, and the cult of celebrity. Scott Timberg joins me in studio. Welcome to Uprising.
Hey, thanks, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, first, how do you define the creative class? We still, of course, have plenty of famous musicians and artists and actors. Hollywood is vibrant, and it seems as though if we were to just judge by what we see on our screens, we might not be able to tell that there is a crisis in this creative class, as you define it.
Yeah, you certainly get a distorted view if you just look at the superstars. You know, if you just look at the sort of mass market entertainment the corporations are churning out, it all looks different. I'm not sure that stuff, say what Hollywood studios are turning out, is at its peak right now, but there are certainly people working. The creative class, though, is complex, is a much broader group. You have people who work in record stores or who used to work in a record store that used to be in your city. You have people who write about culture for a newspaper or a magazine. You have people who run a rock club. There are all kinds of, you have DJs at radio stations, all kinds of people who engage with culture at different levels. They might make it, they might help disseminate it, they might describe it in the press, but it's a large group and it operates as a kind of ecology. The people at the top need the people at the bottom. It's an interrelated kind of structure, and that's what's imperiled. And I don't, the thing people often think about my book, if they haven't really read it, they think, well, there's this guy who thinks that culture is over, that we're going to stop making art, that everything will die immediately. And I'm not saying that. What I am saying is that when artists and craftsmen can't make a living, we all pay the price. It's a much larger crisis when these people can no longer support themselves from their work.
So where do you sort of begin in our recent history to see a decline in the creative class? Because we know that indie bookstores, for example, began closing before the Great Recession hit and perhaps accelerated. After the Great Recession, then we saw the big bookstores start to shut down as well.
That's exactly right. I mean, bookstores are a good indicator of this. We've added, since the mid-90s, we've added about 60 million people to the U.S. population. There are about half as many independent bookstores now as there were then. So the recession was brutal. It was very tough on me, a lot of people I know, lots of people I don't know, people within and without the creative class. The recovery from the recession in some cases has been almost as bad. Median income has gone down since the recovery began. The recession made some existing problems clear. It sort of underlined some things that existed. And there's no, for my argument and the crisis I'm tracing, it's not about any one thing. The recession made things worse. The internet, which has done some great things, also made things worse. But there was also a decline in government support for culture. There's the flattening of middle-class wages. There's the shifting of wealth to the 1% and to the very, very top. There's the influence tech companies have. There's a million different things that came together, and the trick for me was to try to unravel and see how we got here. I actually, in the course of this, I did a lot of research going back to ancient Greece and Rome. How did artists make their living? Why did people want to write, play music, write, stories? How far back does that impulse go? So if you take the long view, I think you can understand this best if you take take a long view.
And so in our recent history, when was the time that we could remember the heyday of arts and culture being? You have this great chapter in your book about Austin, Texas. I have a personal soft spot. I went to school at UT, and Austin, Texas became known as the live music capital of the country, but it's an unlikely place for that.
And
it's in the heart of Texas.
And if you had been there in before the 70s, it would have seemed even more unlikely. I mean, so I'm looking at how a system broke down and how it's put artists and writers, all kinds of people in peril. So I wanted to look at the good times and how things work. So how things had come together to make a cultural scene work. So I looked at, David Byrne writes very well about the punk scene in New York in the 70s. I used his template to look at three places. One is Austin in the 70s, where the alt-country scene came together. Another was Boston in the 50s, where there was a literary and poetry scene. I also looked at Los Angeles in the 60s with the visual art scene around the Ferris Gallery. These were all really fascinating, things to research. And again, it's nice when you see things building and growing and coming together. Austin is particularly interesting. I mean, you have, in any of these places, it comes down partly to personalities. You had the sort of talent and charisma of Willie Nelson, for instance, and a handful of others. You also had things happening in sort of music culture. Dylan, the Byrds, other bands were trying to bring rock music, folk music and country together. It didn't quite work at first. Somehow Austin, for a lot of reasons, partly because the state, a huge university, you didn't have that much else going on culturally. You had a state government which employed people, and you also had soon into it, you had a new weekly that chronicled the scene, and you had this weird sociological thing, which is maybe more important than all of it, which is, to use the technical terms, you had the rednecks and the hippies make peace and come together, which wasn't happening in other parts of Texas in the same way. So you had sort of two constituencies that came together. You had institutions. Part of my book is about how institutions matter. You had clubs, a radio station, and it sort of caught fire somehow.
Right, and so there you have all that sort of infrastructure.
Exactly.
The creative class, the part of the creative class that connects the art to the people, be there. And so at these times, during the sort of heyday of arts and culture movements in various times and places, were artists and other members of the creative class able to make a decent middle-class living? Which I think is the crucial issue here that you're trying to point out in your book.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not saying that art won't exist anymore. I'm saying that the world that we had and the world that I want is one in which a middle-class person who's interested in culture, who's talented, who's driven, and who's lucky, luck has always been part of it too, can have some kind of stake in the in the world of culture, whether it's working at a record store. It might not be a composer of symphonies. It may be working in a bookstore. It may be working in a music
Or it might be a
publishing
violinist in an orchestra, not
Yeah,
necessarily the composer, but
exactly.
yeah, sort of rank and file.
Exactly. There are all kinds of niches, and they all kind of contribute to again, the whole system. And, you look at musicians through the ages, say Miles Davis, one of the most important musicians in, hit any century, was able to make his living partly because he was talented and driven and a genius, but also because there were record labels, Blue Note, Columbia, and so on, which existed and charged money for records, and much of the money made it back to the musicians. Some of it went to the labels, and people overlook the fact that it sounds so basic now, but that world is in some ways is fading fast.
And I want to bring up this issue of how the music industry has evolved today and what that has done to musical artists. But before we go into that, I feel like your book takes on a few myths when it comes to the issue of the creative class. One is that we always expect artists to struggle, and that's the sort of romantic idea of artists. And the other is, because we always expect them to have to struggle, they also do often emerge from a privileged class. But that's not necessarily true, or that hasn't been necessarily true in the past, is it?
Well, I guess it's two different things. First of all, you asked where the sort of trouble started, right? Like where did we get the beginning? In a lot of ways, we saw the results of it around the year 2000, which is where the employment, record sales, journalistic employment, independent bookstores, a lot of things that I value peaked around 2000, given a year or two. But the myth of the struggling artist, which really picked up its steam in 19th century Paris, is part of the problem. I mean, what you've described means that a tech company or somebody who doesn't like my argument, say, can say, well, artists are pampered, they're privileged, they need to really. They need to suffer. Look at Van Gogh, look at et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It becomes a way to ask artists to work for free or live in poverty. So it's a dangerous myth that again, goes back a while. As far as middle-class people, not everybody who's become an artist or a filmmaker or whatever, privilege or family money certainly helps, always has. In the Renaissance, art was much more for the rich than it is today. So what I'm talking about is sort of a modern thing. But, whether we're talking about the Beatles, jazz musicians, poets, people in classical music, people who go into film, the vast majority of people who go into culture, some of them don't make it all the way through, but the people who do it are typically coming from the middle class. They're hoping to go through a period of sleeping on couches, free internships, working at the record store for minimum wage. They're hoping to get back into the middle class and to have some kind of purchase on it. And that was the way it worked for decades and decades. And as the middle class has been dismantled starting in about the 80s, the map has started to change.
Let's talk about how the internet impacted music as one example of why we've seen such a drastically different landscape today. So on the one hand, there are more opportunities than ever, and yet fewer than ever. For example, an indie musician doesn't need a record label as much anymore as, as he or she used to. Could post a song online, develop a loyal fan base without having to go through gatekeepers, earn legions of fans, but earn almost nothing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Musicians end up, you know, I was covering music on and off in the 90s when this stuff was starting to happen, and you know, there were I guess two things that I remember. First of all, when the internet was kicking in the say early 90s, it was going to be this sort of democratic bohemia, right? Every possible niche and every kind of avant-garde music and everything else was going to be unleashed, you know, to have a fan base, and artists would all, it was like this sort of alternative culture was going to have an infusion of attention and money and all these things. Then a few years later, we started to realize that musicians were, because of Napster and other sort of, you know, services and piracy and so on, musicians were suddenly not making money, labels weren't making money, you know, revenues were collapsing. That ended up being the template for what would happen to the rest of us. I didn't really realize it at the time, but it's the same model that's happened to journalism and a lot of other things as well. So yes, if you're an amateur and you want to make a song and send it around, you can do it. If you're trying to make a living or even part of a living as a musician, artist, writer, journalist, etc., things have become much tougher.
Aren't the rest of us also to blame? I mean, we as a whole partake in the wholesale theft of music, of creative work by illegally downloading movies and music. And as you point out in your book, ordinarily ethical people, when it's pointed out that they're essentially stealing, say, well, it's the record labels that are getting the bulk of that we're getting the bulk of the money anyway, and the artists were never really getting paid that much. And so we're just, you know, ripping off Time Warner, not the artists, when we steal music. Is that true?
It's certainly true that's the attitude of a lot of people, especially, you know, young people who've used download services, pirate services. They think, oh, it's just the suits, you know, who are you're undercutting everybody, and the money that used to make it to the musicians was the way they were able to make this stuff, and when that happens, they don't get paid. It's that simple. But you're right that that's a kind of myth that's spread around a lot, and you know, it's interesting that in the last decade or so, people have realized, say, that food is important and that where it comes from is important, and the people who make it, the farmers and so on. So we've had this revolution with organic food, farmers markets, small batch beer, that sort of thing. That sensibility needs to cross over to culture more. People need to know that the bookstore in their town, the record store, the artist, the writer, this stuff could disappear if you don't support it. And people, I'm hoping people will become more conscious of the consequences of their actions.
Well, as a fellow journalist, I'm glad that you include journalists in the creative class. We have the same conundrum when it comes to media. Look at our TV show. I mean, it costs money to produce a TV show. We're competing with commercial shows that have tons of money, with lots of marketing, and not only do we have to create the content ourselves, but which is, of course, the joy, what we love to do, but we have to distribute it. We have to get it to people in a landscape when increasingly everything is for free, where we're left with almost no options but to commercialize. And so let's talk now about the fact that corporatization and commercialization has infused our culture and kind of left our creative class with so few options. What effect has that had on the product itself?
Well, what you've described is again, a sort of a microcosm of what's happening in a lot of different places. I mean, part of the dream of culture, at least for the last couple centuries, is that it come from a sort of a real, in the case of, say, art, that it comes from a real sort of self, you know, that there's somebody who's really thought things through, felt things, whether it's, again, painter, musician, blah, blah, blah. There's the same kind of idea in journalism. There's supposed to be an integrity to it, right? It's supposed to be something that's dreamed up because you have an urge for justice or truth or whatever. It's not supposed to be, well, let's do this story because our own, you know, the owner hates that guy and we want to shut his family down for a drunk driving arrest or whatever. And the journalistic world that I was raised in, which was largely newspapers, and my dad was a newspaper reporter as well, had a very strict wall between the advertising side and what we call editorial side. This will sound very abstract to people who aren't in journalism, but what it means is that the owner, the people who take out ads, the money, big and small, does not affect what the newspaper reports or doesn't report. They're the same kind of ethical lines are at substantial newspaper and radio stations as well, TV and radio stations as well. That has, in the age of the internet, broken down. There's now a lot more sort of lifestyle branding posing as journalism.
The clickbait headlines.
Yeah, clickbait, all kinds of things. I don't know that I have anything original to say about it, except that this is, to me, not an improvement. And what you've described is true. As far as the pressures that, say, a station like this face, I mean, it's even worse on the internet. If you have two identical, say, news sites, and one of them does reporting, hires people, and invests in writing and news gathering, it will lose to an identical, rival that just steals the stuff. They're not spending any money, but they're getting the same content and the same number of hits. So the system is rigged right now.
Eventually, the sources of the content will get fewer and fewer to the point
Right.
where we'll be sharing nothing. I mean, how often have people clicked on stories to find that it's not really a story, or that it's something
Right.
completely different, or it's something utterly diluted? And that's a tragedy. Let's talk about what has happened to the creative class today in this landscape. You quote one person that you interviewed in your book, who said, quote, "I've seen a lot of people go into marketing or help companies and want to be cool. What artists do now is help brands build an identity. They end up styling or set decorating." I found that statement to be so depressing. I mean, this is just sad. But it's true. People have to make a living. They have to eat.
Yeah, I found that depressing too. I would find it more depressing if people just read that and shrugged it off and said, "Hey, this is the way the world is now." You should be frustrated to hear that because, again, the idea of being an artist or a writer or a critic or a journalist or something was to have some kind of independence and integrity. And when we all
Not that,
become,
by the way, styling and set decoration is a
sure, we need people to,
nothing wrong with
we need
that.
people to do this. But if the goal is to have a sort of independent culture, an independent journalistic world that can ask difficult questions, and some kinds of culture about asking difficult questions too. I mean, think of the line of, say, social criticism that goes through European theater or American, muckraking novelists and so on. There's documentary filmmakers. I mean, there's obviously been a line of social and political criticism in the arts. How do we get it if everything is corporate owned and everybody's trying to please the marketplace? That's, to me, again, not a healthy culture, and that is the direction in which it's going.
Do you include arts educators in the creative class? Because we've seen, of course, a complete evisceration of our arts education as school budgets have been slashed as well, which it really goes to the heart of where our next generation of members of the creative class are coming from.
If I had had a little more time and space in this book, I would have done an entire chapter on that. I agree that it's crucial. And when I talk about the creative class or the arts ecology, that it's an ecosystem that has all kinds of layers to it, that's part of what I'm talking about. That's been especially acute in California, as I might not have to tell you. I have a kid in public school here. My wife works in the public school system. The gutting of even basic arts and music education is absolutely part of the problem. And we've, it started in the 90s to some extent. We've put money into practical things, testing, technology. LAUSD just spent, close to $1 billion getting kids tablets that ended up being a disaster. Think of the number of art and music teachers you could bring in. When you do that, not only do you employ people who are artists and musicians themselves, you also seed the next generation, as you say. I mean, my investment in this stuff, I don't come from a rich background. I was probably the last generation where there was some of this stuff in the public school. So I remember people coming in. I remember once or twice a week having, that helped spark my interest in this. If you jump forward for the generation that we're talking about, the generation a little bit younger than me, who didn't have this kind of basic education, you jump forward to what people are majoring in college. This is partly because privatization means that universities and colleges are getting a lot less money from the state. It's more expensive, so people are being forced to be more pragmatic. But you see the number of people majoring in English and the arts and things like that. In other words, it's kind of people who will become theater goers, who will go to a dance concert, who will buy a classical music record or go to a jazz club. You see that whole means of transmission getting cut cut apart. And again, you're absolutely right. It starts in childhood.
So, isn't this story that you're telling in your book, Culture Crash, a microcosm of what we see broadly speaking about income inequality in the United States? The rallying cry of the Occupy Wall Street movement, we are the 99%, but if you have to be a 1%er to be part of the creative class these days, what is that going to do to the state of our culture?
That's exactly it. I mean, that's the right question. That you mentioned the suffering artist myth earlier. There's that, and there's a sort of hero artist myth, which goes back to the Renaissance or even before. So we think of artists as sort of in the gutter, sort of after an absinthe overdose or something, or we think of them as these sort of figures soaring over the, or someone who the Pope, would bow to back in the 15th century or something. Most people in the creative class come from the middle class. They're exposed to all of the pressures and ravages that the rest of the middle class is. So in a world in which the 1% and the top tier of the 1% own everything, it's not going to end well for the creative class or the middle class.
So let's talk about how we can revive the creative class. I mean, we do have a history in the U.S. of financially supporting the arts through government subsidies, which is very appropriate in my opinion. You can go to FDR's Works Progress Administration, GI Bill, and public subsidies and public funding of arts education in schools. Is there a model for how we can, in our current landscape, dominated by the internet, dominated by the tech companies, how can we revive our creative class?
Well, it's an important question, and the crisis I trace has all kinds of causes. So it goes back again a couple centuries. You mentioned the middle class before. Until the middle class is robust again and secure, and we cease to be a plutocracy where Wall Street and the tech companies basically run everything in the world of culture and outside the world of culture, things aren't going to get better. Again, if school, education, arts education at the earliest level, elementary school doesn't come back, things are not going to improve either. One thing we can do is be kind of clear-eyed about what the internet has done to us and done to culture. And I don't mean we have to hate the internet or shut it down. We need to be honest about what it's done and take a look at what's happened. We need to stop giving, say, tax cuts to companies like Amazon, which didn't pay taxes for years, so there was an unfair competition against your local bookstore. You and I can probably think of a bunch of bookstores and record stores we knew in our towns, our neighborhoods, that were crushed by this. So we've got to stop.
Special,
yes, I remember I love Midnight Special. Yeah, absolutely. So
I want to cry when I think of how many of them have closed. It's just tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got to stop the unfair competition. We also need, Elizabeth Warren has said that if you don't have a lobbyist or you don't have sort of a big kind of muscle in Washington, you're going to get crushed. And she's right. Artists, because they tend to be independent, are scattered, all over the country. Many of them, they might be signed to a record label or a publishing house, but they're largely independent, and because of that, sort of atomized. One of the things that's important, and there's a movement that started in this direction, is to bring artists together somehow, often artists across disciplines, writers, musicians, graphic designers, etc. That movement, there's a group called Content Creators Coalition that started up recently that I know a little bit about. That's the right idea. If artists and writers and craftsmen don't have a seat at the table in Washington and other places where policy is drawn up, this crisis will continue to get worse. It'll continue to get crushed by the big forces here.
So, of course, we have to solve then that larger problem and tackle that larger problem of income inequality. And I'm wondering, you do refer in your book to the role that a piece of legislation like Obamacare has played.
Right.
If we're in a landscape where artists have to be increasingly self-employed, finally there might be a chance for them to actually get health care, because we're slowly enabling self-employed people to get it through Obamacare.
Yeah, I mean, Obamacare isn't perfect. This was a plan that was developed by the Heritage Foundation and applied by a Republican governor. It's not perfect, but it's put 10 million or so people who were, many of them in Texas, incidentally, on medical insurance, kept them from bankruptcy. I've had friends suffer incredibly because they had some minor little injury and their hospital bill was in the tens of thousands. I came because I lost my job when the recession hit at the LA Times, and my wife is a school librarian who was laid off every year for the next 5 years. She always got her job back, but we have a small child. We came within weeks to losing our medical insurance completely. So it's serious business. So Obamacare, again, isn't perfect, but despite our crowing as Americans that we're the land of the free and we're entrepreneurial and there are all these options, until you have those kind of basic safety net protections, people cannot take the same kind of chances that they do in what we disdain as old Europe. You know, if you don't have a foundation, only the rich will be able to take the chance that art requires.
Well, finally, Scott, what do you say to those of us who see ourselves as an important part of the creative class only because the internet has enabled us? I mean, today we have bloggers who might not have been writing, regardless of the quality of their writing, musicians who might not be musicians, regardless of the quality of their musicians,
Right.
because they feel like they finally have an opportunity to get some traction online. And, you know, for us to not count those people in the creative class reeks of elitism.
Well, I'm a proud amateur musician. I play jazz guitar. I'm in an indie rock band out of my garage. The internet allowed us recently to record a few songs, like a David Bowie song and a Neil Young song, and put it on SoundCloud. It was a lot of fun. It's very meaningful for my friends and I. Here's the thing. You do not want people like me to be the only people making culture. Right. You don't want a culture of amateurism. If you do, everybody loses. To have that as a hobby is great, but if you don't have people who are professionals, who have invested their lives in it, who have committed to the dues paying and so on, the apprenticeships, in the same way that I don't want nothing but amateur journalists. I read blogs as well. Some of them are quite good, some of them aren't. I don't want a world, and I don't think you do, where it's only people who are sort of moonlighting on the side are making art, culture, journalism, novels, etc. I believe in the idea of the author and the musician and the journalist as a profession, as a caste. That's something that I want to protect. And if democratizing means wiping it away, I'm not sure that's a real democracy.
Right. And so, I mean, we may find ourselves, hopefully, having a vision of a world where both can be around, where people can choose. And of course, there are times when the amateur does become the professional. So
yeah,
sadly,
exactly.
we've got more professionals being forced to be amateurs and
yeah,
have it as a side
or waiters
job.
or cab drivers or whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I want to thank you very much, Scott, for joining us today. Best of luck to you with your book.
Yeah, thanks for your interest in the book. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. Scott Timberg has been my guest. He's a former arts reporter for the Los Angeles Times, writing on music and culture. He's also a blogger and a journalist and an adjunct writing professor. His new book is called Culture Crash, the Killing of the Creative Class. This is Uprising. Bipasha Shom is our senior producer. Anna Buss is our assistant producer. Alexander Hobbs is our technical director. Christian Beck is our production assistant. Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you tomorrow.